Hi everybody, I hope you're doing well. In this short lecture, I'm going to be talking about William Butler Yeats, who lived from 1865 to 1939, and is one of the single most important Irish literary figures, right up there with people like James Joyce and Oscar Wilde. So definitely someone who should be on your radar. Talk a little bit before we get to the poems that you were assigned about his family background. Yeats was Anglo-Irish, which means he was both British and Irish ethnically, and you'll kind of see that as something that's influenced his poetry to a certain extent, namely because a lot of his poems are preoccupied with rejuvenating and even defining Irish culture, in distinction to the inherited and kind of dominant English literary traditions that kind of were taken for granted in this period of literary history. So, trying to come up with, in other words, a specifically Irish approach to poetry is something that you'll see in a lot of his work. His parents, well, I'll just say a couple of things about them really briefly. His father gave up law actually to pursue a painting career, and he wasn't particularly successful at painting. Didn't really make a ton of money from doing it, but this painting actually of William Butler Yeats is actually the work of his father. If you look up in the top right there, you can see J.B. Yeats, and I believe it says 1900. So that is one of his compositions. His mother was from a family who lived near Sligo. That's Sligo. It's one of the three places that I'm going to be talking about in this lecture today because it's significant with respect to his background and eventually the poetry that he would compose. Sligo's west of Ireland. We'll look at a map in a few minutes. And Yeats spent a lot of time there growing up. His family moved to London in 1874. He was actually born in Dublin, but they went to London in 1874, and then they found themselves back in Dublin by 1880. And Yeats later would return to London yet again. When he was about your age, Yeats went to high school, and then switched to art school, thinking about following in his father's footsteps. And eventually he left art school because he wanted to concentrate just on poetry. All right, and religious skepticism. From his father, W.B. Yeats inherits a bit of religious skepticism. His father famously, we have a quote, believed in the religion of art. Yeats was a spiritual person, and like a lot of Irish people in particular, has these sort of cultural mores pushing him towards religiosity. You guys all know many Irish people are Catholic, and if you're not Catholic, you're basically a Protestant. But Yeats actually found himself unable to buy into Christian dogma, into Christian orthodoxy. And for much of his life, he would kind of look for an alternative to organized religion. The Norton Anthology of English Literature notes that he was led to various kinds of mysticism. He looked at folklore, theosophy, spiritualism, and even Neoplatonism, which we've talked a little bit about this year. Eventually, he would say that he made his own new religion, which was, quote, almost an infallible church of poetic tradition. So, as I said, Yeats, growing up, would spend his time in a couple different places, namely Dublin, London, and Sligo. And each one of these places is significant when it comes to his maturation and progress as a young poet. So let's start with Dublin. As I said, he was born in Dublin in 1865, and his family returned in 1880 after leaving in 1874 to go to London. In Dublin, Yeats founded what's called the National Literary Society, and he was also uh, eventually influenced by nationalism. And we've talked about nationalism a bit this year, this intense passion and pride for one's country. Typically, it's used in a sort of negative sense, um, but it did have an impact on Yeats when he was young, and it's especially in Dublin where he would have been exposed to nationalism. I'll get to this in a couple of minutes, but by the time that Yeats turns to nationalism and this attempt to rejuvenate and define Irish culture, he's already moved a little bit away from the romanticism that defines his earlier works of poetry. As for the nationalism, though, Yeats in particular had a big problem, your Norton Anthology points out, with people who wanted to use literature for political ends. So he's interested in the idea and in the philosophy of Irish nationalism, but the idea of using Irish art as a way to pursue a political agenda was something that he couldn't get on board with. He was interested, though, in the extent to which literature could shape Irish culture, and they could try to, establish a literary identity that was more specifically their own, in contrast to English identity or Scottish identity or what have you. Okay, so next I have, let's go back here a second. So you've got a picture, it's a photograph of Dublin around the turn of the century. To the left you have a monument to Yeats, who I said is one of the most important literary figures in Ireland. And then this last picture that looks like an apartment, this is where he lived for quite some time. I've actually been there. I think a lot of you know that I lived in Ireland for a while when I was taking PhD classes at, it's called University College Dublin. This is a house in what's called Merrion Square, Merrion. I think it's actually university owned at this point. I would need to double check it. I have been inside. I attended a philosophy lecture, basically, in that building. And yeah, it's just too funny for me to lecture on this stuff to you guys because, this was, I guess, 2014 that I was living in Dublin, so the nostalgia obviously kind of speaks to me. All right, so next we have Sligo. These are actual, just remarkable images of what you see in Sligo, and it almost reminds me of like Australia or something, especially the top left one. It looks like the famous Ayers Rock that's in Australia. You look at this, or maybe you would think that this is the American West, somewhere around the Grand Canyon or something, but no, that is in fact in Ireland, in Sligo. If you look at the map that I have there, so the light green is Ireland, and then the dark green is the particular county that we're talking about here with Sligo. So as I said, his mother's family lived nearby Sligo, and Yeats spent much of his childhood in Sligo. It was in the countryside of Sligo that Yeats developed his knowledge of peasant life, being close to nature, living sort of a simpler existence compared to what you would have in Dublin or certainly in London. He was also exposed in Sligo to a lot of Irish folklore. Even after they were living elsewhere, Yeats's family would regularly go to Sligo for holidays and whatnot. The last point I want to make about Sligo is that it was when Yeats was a teenager that his father read to him Walden by Henry David Thoreau. You probably, unless you're an AP Lang, read that last year in English 3, or parts of it at least. Just to remind you what it's about, Thoreau goes to live simply near this lake in a cabin that actually was owned by Emerson, another really famous transcendentalist American author. And the idea was that it was almost like a spiritual thing, that there was a certain sort of knowledge and truth that someone could acquire just by living that simple lifestyle without all of the excess that, you know, defined a more urban existence. Even truer today, if you think about it, but already, you know, a couple hundred years ago, that was something that poets and novelists were starting to pick up upon. So, as a teenager, Yeats is exposed to this Thoreau book, and you'll find that it has a definite influence on his poetry, especially his early poetry. Okay. Thirdly, we have London. So I've already given you some of these dates, but they're there from 1874 to 1880 when they go back to Dublin, and then he'll eventually come back in the 1890s. It is in London that Innisfree is written, which was the first poem you were assigned to read, and I'll talk about that in a minute. It's in London that Yeats, as a young man, establishes a lot of his more romantic ideas about poetry. As the Norton edition puts it, this idea that poetry should be, specifically its language, should be dreamy, evocative, and ethereal. It was also in London that Yeats founded interestingly, in London, the Irish Literary Society, which is still around, and you can see that their official logo actually has the year there, which of course we give credit to Yeats for founding that. Okay, so the Lake Isle of Innisfree is one of the most famous and loved Irish poems of all time. It is a really big deal over there. I was reading a New York Times article actually that I'll give you in the sources at the end here that talks about how Innisfree is almost like a brand in Ireland. That all sorts of products and commodities have Innisfree as the name that you can buy. I think the example was like Innisfree lip gloss or something like that. In 1999, one Irish newspaper had a open vote for the all-time greatest work of Irish poetry, and Innisfree won, number one, the top favorite. So as I said, really well-known, really big deal. A lot of Irish people would be super, super familiar with this poem. Okay, so it's both a romantic evocation of escaping into the world of dreams and art and the imagination. You also at the same time have, as I've said, an attempt to produce something that's decidedly and specifically Irish. And here we see a focus in particular on the idea of freedom and self-reliance, which also, again, is reminiscent of Thoreau's Walden. In fact, his sort of mentor, Emerson, literally has a famous text called On Self-Reliance. So the idea here is to produce something with an Irish origin instead of, something that followed the norms that were defining English poetry and English literature. It's for sure a young man's poem, and it'll be really clear why that's the case when we look at the other poem, which is certainly not a young man's poem, in a couple of minutes. But this was written when Yeats was only 23, in the year 1888, living in London, of course. And it was published 2 years later in 1890. Yeats says that, "I had still the ambition, formed in Sligo in my teens, of living in imitation of Thoreau on Innisfree. And when walking through Fleet Street," that's a very famous street in London, "very homesick, I heard a little tinkle of water and saw a fountain in a shop window which balanced in a little ball upon its jet, and I began to remember lake water. From the sudden remembrance came my poem, Innisfree." I pulled that from Norton on page 2391. So Innisfree is a real place um, in Sligo. It is uninhabited. This is an actual photograph that I have here. And you can see there's quite clearly a sort of cottage type thing, but it's a ruin. No one actually lives in this place. So the poem itself is filled with this sort of longing for the past. Let me go ahead and jump to my next. There we go. Um, the Irish past, the um, mythologized past, Yeats' own personal past, things that he remembers from that personal past. So the countryside, Sligo, islands, lakes, all of this comes together in this poem. So you'll see here that I have the poem again, and I've just highlighted, not highlighted, I've bolded certain words or phrases that I want to kind of elaborate a little bit upon. So the first one is "I will arise." We know for a fact this is deliberately archaic language. What that means is when I was reading academic articles, getting ready to make this lecture, somebody said even in 1888, no one would say something like "I will arise." It was already by then considered to be overly formal, overly old school way of talking. Yeats himself actually writes that within a few years he never could have written such a line again. Meaning that within the span of just a few years, he really reconsidered a lot of his principles and a lot of his ideas about what made good poetry. And this sort of deliberately archaic language is something that he absolutely would not have employed. He says the same thing, actually, if we can jump down to the final quatrain, which is just this third stanza, so the one that begins, "I will arise and go now for always night and day." There's a poetic inversion in here. Inversion's also called apostrophe. And it's just when you have words that are in the opposite order of what you typically would have in that language. So it's that penultimate line, "Pavements gray," right? Ordinarily would say "gray pavements." So that poetic inversion, Yeats also says that within a few years, I never would have done that sort of thing. Okay, so back up to the first quatrain, the very second line of the poem, he talks about the small cabin that he would build there. That's a very obvious reference to Thoreau and to Walden, this idea of living simply, living within nature without, as I've said already, all of the excess of city life. To live alone in the bee loud glade, alone with nature, but you also have this image here of saturated nature, that nature that's almost like an overflowing cup. And that's a juxtaposition, right? Because you have on the one hand him living in isolation, him living alone within nature that's like this cornucopia of just abundance and riches. Jumping to the second quatrain, you'll see that I bolded peace. So we have a identification with peace and nature, again different from the busy bustling city of London. And here specifically, peace comes dropping slow. So peace is being compared to water, and drops of water are interesting. If you think of something like a faucet in your house that's dropping slow, it's almost like a sort of paradox in terms of how we conceptualize that dropping of water, because they're just drops, right? It's not a ton of water, but there's also like this image of completion and fullness to it, right? It's a dropping, bit of water from a faucet isn't a picture of lack or of absence. To the contrary, it's an image of excess, of abundance. So obviously what I'm trying to do here is connect that first line of the second quatrain with the "Be Loud Glade" that terminates the first quatrain. So I'm saying it's essentially the same image there of copious overabundance. Okay, next, dropping from the veils of the morning. So this is just interesting because it's a specifically effeminate personification of a time of day. So you have, and we've talked about this all year, right? All of the archetypes of Mother Earth and so on and so forth. Here you have this specifically female time which implies, providing for everything, producing everything out of nothing, right? The ultimate origin of all things. And then lastly, in the final quatrain here, you have always night and day. A little bit ambiguous here the way he's worded it, but what is it that these words are modifying? It's the sound. If you look to the following line, always night and day, I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore. Again, that image of eternity, that image of timelessness, of something that's permanent. And I hear it in my heart's deep core at the very end, very famous conclusion to this poem. What the poet's saying here is that this place is part of my identity, right? Where he hears this sound of the water deep in his very being. And remember the story of how he composed this. He's walking on a busy street in London, and he kind of just zones out for a second and sees this fountain and hears the trickling water. And immediately, this is like something you guys know I love to refer to Proust in Search of Lost Time. This is like when you eat the Madeleine cookie and it brings you back to something from your past that's triggered just by a sense experience. In this case, it's audition, right? He hears something and then he sees what was producing the sound. I often compare this in class to when I smell the same perfume that my grandmother wears. It's like it, triggers something in my brain where I almost expect to see her, even though it's just like a stranger walking by me in the mall. So this water that reminds him of this specific place, that also reminds him of being outside of time and of being completely peaceful, is something that's like baked into his very identity. Okay. So that's Innisfree. Innisfree is, as I've said, a work of early, poetry from Yeats, and his early poetry is quite different from stuff that he produced later. So I'm going to tell a little story about 1902 and kind of one of the reasons why his poetry started to change. This isn't the only reason, but it's, as a philosopher, one of the things that I found the most provocative. In short, a friend loans him a bunch of Nietzsche's books in 1902. And these books were extremely exciting to Yeats. They had a really big impact on him. And he started to really radically reconsider a lot of the things that he had up to that point taken for granted when it came to his art, when it came to his poetry. Specifically, it was in reading Nietzsche that he wanted a more active stance and a more vigorous style in his art. That's from the Norton edition, page 2387. He wanted also to make everything, quote, hard and clear, and leave behind sentiment and sentimental sadness. So what he's saying is, this is not what my early poetry was like, right? That it was inactive. It had a certain lifelessness to it. It had a certain almost sterility compared to the more vigorous poetry that I want to compose. My early poetry also was overly abstract. It, was not clear enough. It got too muddled into ideas and concepts and abstract representations that I kind of lost track of my way. It was also overly defined by emotional response. So Yeats will, after reading Nietzsche, produce works that have less formal quality. They're more stripped down. You could say that they're more bare. You could even call it, I saw this in one of the articles I was reading, a naked style. And one reason that a lot of scholars say that about his work post-Nietzsche is that he still has a certain amount of the formal language. I mean, he's a poet. Oftentimes you're going to have a little bit of that in poetry. But he fuses that formal language with a much more worldly, a much more direct, you could even say a much more vulgar way of using language. I mean, we're almost talking about like slang, right? I've many times this year talked about that adjective vulgar and how, there's like vulgar lyrics in a song that then make it a parental advisory record. And then there's also this like academic usage of vulgar that just means like the folk, right? So like the vulgar way of saying something, often what that means is it's very basic, it's very direct, it doesn't mince words, right? So you'll see, as I'm saying here, Yeats start to marry both of those different types of language in his poetry. He says that he tries to leave behind the embroideries of his youth. When he uses that sewing term, embroideries, what he's talking about is the sort of thing that we saw in Innisfree, like the poetic inversion, the apostrophe, the deliberately archaic language, I arise, right? These are the sort of things that he wants to surpass as he perfects his craft. So we can actually see this difference even in the two poems that you guys read, Innisfree and then The Wild Swans at Cool, which is a poem from Yeats's middle period, 1916 and 1917 is when he wrote this. And I think that as we work through this here, it'll be really quite obvious how it is, in a way, sort of similar, but also super different from the Innisfree poem. Okay, so a little bit about what leads up to him composing this poem. In a nutshell, he's really having a bit of a rough time. If you do the math, he would be like 51 years old when he wrote this. So in contrast to Innisfree, which is 23, super young, this is from a much more mature perspective and from a much more mature poet. Now, you might think that because he's older, he's maybe more successful, and to a certain extent that's true. He actually eventually would work as a senator in Ireland, actually. And some of his poems were certainly popular, in his own lifetime. He's not one of those poets, as we often see, who dies basically unknown and destitute. Lot of poets are that way, right? You're kind of discovered after you're already 6 feet under. Yeats, not really so much. What was going poorly in his personal life around this time comes down to two things: his love life and his, let's say, political life. With his love life, he basically had been rejected twice. In all the way back in, I should say, 1889, Yeats met this actually really famous Irish woman named Maud Gonne, Gonne, and really spent like years trying to court her. He was desperately in love with her. She refused to marry him. He wrote a ton of early love poetry about her. And ultimately he gets really upset with her because she was really focused on political activism and was more interested in that than settling down with him in married life. In fact, Maud Gonne's often called like a proto-feminist, so very well known. So this next part's kind of cringy. He, let's see here, basically goes for, at that point, her daughter. I'm looking here. I think her name is Iseult, actually, which brings us back to the King Arthur stuff we were looking at earlier in the year. Iseult. Basically, he goes for Iseult, who also turns away his advances. So doesn't have a shot with mom. So then takes his chances with the daughter and fails there as well. So not great. But in short, the point here is this continued rejection by women that he desires. The other thing was, as I said, the political problem. Really, it's more about Ireland than about Yeats himself. Ireland was, at this point, in a really, intense state of political upheaval. In fact, even during my life, that's, been something that Ireland has had to deal with when it comes down to the conflict between Ireland and North Ireland and, the NRA and those sorts of things. So the love life and then this concern over what's going to happen to Ireland as a political state kind of has Yeats down in the dumps. And as we go through this poem, you're going to kind of see the difference between this and Innisfree, which has this, kind of youthful optimism to it that the Wild Swans just does not have, okay? So let's go This is the same thing. I just got rid of the image, and you'll see that I've bolded again a couple of things that I want to point out. So first, give me just 1 second. Okay, so we have in this opening stanza the image of stillness, the still sky. If you go all the way to the final stanza, you'll see that you again have stillness used as an adjective, this time talking about water instead of the sky. But at least in this very first stanza, the idea here, it's not that similar to Innisfree, really. It's a representation of timelessness, of eternity, of something that's immortal, something that'll exist forever. So you'll see that this poem really has a lot of movement in it. That first stanza basically paints this picture of timelessness and eternity, and you'll see that we're going to move or pivot towards the poet or the speaker and his positioning inside of time, inside of this constantly changing, constantly evolving, chaotic world. But before I get to that, if you look at the end of this first stanza where we have 9 and 50, in other words, 59 swans, one of the articles I was looking at, specifically by Puvel, points out that it would be very difficult to count that many swans moving around, right? It actually reminds me of Mario Party mini games where you have to count objects that some of them are exploding or some of them, it looks like a character but it's actually a mushroom cap, something like that. Imagine sitting at a lake and trying to count 59 swans. It just would be very difficult. So what Puvel points out is that this is essentially to distance the poet from human reality. This almost, I don't want to call it a superhero feat, but certainly something that would be extraordinarily difficult for most of us. The sort of otherworldly nature of this is a way to institute that distancing, right, from real human reality. So in the second stanza, you'll see, reference to 19 Autumns. So Yeats had been making long summer visits to Cool, which is a real place. I think I had an image on the previous slide, all the way back to 1897. So 1916, 1917 are when he's writing this poem. He'd been going there since the late 1890s. And that's really where you see time start to enter the poem. In the first stanza, as I've said, it's a lot like Innisfree. You have trees in their autumn beauty. Autumn will be important in a minute here. You have dry paths, right? And a still sky. So again, this picture of like nature existing almost outside of time, just like a snapshot, perfectly frozen moment. All of a sudden in the second stanza, when the speaker interpolates the situation or interrupts the situation, it's like a jerk back to reality. He's been coming for 19 years. And this is in direct contrast to that still image of the first stanza, right? Here we have the passage of subjective time. The other really interesting thing here in this second stanza is those swans. So this aggregation of 59 swans scatters. They all suddenly mount and scatter, wheeling in great broken wings upon their clamorous wings. So this is like meaningless chaos, right? They were all nice and neat and orderly. He had supposedly counted them, and there were 59 of them. And then all of a sudden, they just scatter in every direction. What's the significance of this? The idea here, according to Gates, is that it's a picture of meaningless chaos. That until the poet adds meaning to it, makes it an image, gives it some determinate nature, gives it some structure, it has no value. It has no meaning. The idea is almost like to snatch a moment and give it form, right, by turning it into a poem. In the third stanza, you'll see that even more has changed. The speaker's heart is now sore. And we'll see that it's sore because of the difference between himself and these brilliant creatures. Um, these brilliant creatures who, in the fourth stanza, Yeats tells us, uh, have not grown old in their hearts like he has, right? So we know that he's growing old, right? We have this um, reference to 19 autumns, and we have a sore heart, but the swans are different from him, right? They do not have the sort of issues that he, as a human, has to contend with. They're free from the worries, right? They're just wandering around. So, as a rejected lover, he is different from them in another reason. You'll see that it says, unwearied still, lover by lover. They paddle in the cold, companionable streams or climb the air. Their hearts have not grown old, as I said. So, he is not like them, right? Unwearied does not define him. He has been rejected by lover after lover, and he's finding it difficult to carry on, right? Um, but the swans, it comes back to that, eternity versus, um, finite time thing that's preoccupied our focus so far, and even was a big thing when we were looking at Keats last week. There's a certain timelessness to it, right? They just keep going on as they will. So, oh, sorry. We have again a juxtaposition between the poet as entrenched in time without any control over its flow, right? Everything feels like it's constantly changing and heading towards, decay and, non existence, non being. Here you have something that's just running its course and will run its course ad infinitum. So, what we want to think about is what really is it that's got this timeless nature to it when it comes to the swans. It's their interactions, right? The poem is really quite clear about that. It's the way in which they're interacting with each other, right? Lover by lover. And unwearied from that, right? From constantly cycling through, from constantly going through this ordeal. So these interactions, these relationships that are dynamic instead of static, right? They're constantly changing. And the swans have no problem with that, right? But Yeats, on a personal level, has really struggled with this in his own life. But if he can grasp towards these interactions and identify in them a certain sort of timelessness, a certain sort of eternity, all of a sudden he sees something beautiful and something true. All right, the fifth and final stanza here. I'm going to quote a pretty well-known article from Tobin. So, of the swans, their eventual disappearance from the speaker's sight allows him a glimpse of happiness beyond his personal sorrow, even as that sorrow is intensified. This final leap draws personal utterance beyond the personal experience of the speaker into the public realm. The personal becomes something transpersonal. The arrival of the transpersonal through the personal characterizes Yeats' greatest poems, the end to which personal utterance is given. So you'll see that I've bolded still water and to find they have flown away in that final stanza. And this is the one that Tobin is remarking upon, right? The speaker comes back 19 years. Every year he finds these swans, and if he's able to reflect on their behavior, he finds a certain eternal beauty in what they're doing. But look at how the poem ends, right? The poem ends with this reference to some eventual day that the swans no longer will be there, right? And there's something that has defined his experience that, cool, he goes and he expects to see them. They're just part of the experience. And then here at the very end, they're removed from the picture. So partly this is taking himself out of the situation, right? I mean, notice the subjective way in which this is worded. When I awake someday, to find they have flown away. So they have just gone elsewhere, right? They're still doing all of their eternal, timeless, infinite things, infinitely beautiful things somewhere else. But for me, they're not here, right? So again, what this poem is doing is emphasizing or underscoring the poet's transient life, his mortality. He has to contend with this idea that death is an absolute guarantee, and he's 51 years old. He's closer than he was, by definition, at any other point in his life, obviously. So, again, this is, a turn back in the ending of the poem here towards that subjective positioning of the poet, that problem that he has to deal with. But now he at least has some sort of model that he can take to grasp towards the eternal beauty. And here's the really important thing, guys. Notice how he's taken this image, he's taken this scene, and using language has turned it into a poem and has immortalized it. This is, again, very close to what we were talking about in my Yeats lecture. He's taken his own finite existence and produced something that's infinite, something that, I mean, it's over 100 years now, 2020, written in 1916 or 17, and people are still reading this. Every prep school, kids are reading this. Every university, kids are reading this. And when we read it, we're able to grasp that same eternal truth and beauty that is embodied in those relations of the swans, right? But there's also like a sort of call to us, and it's to look at our own lives in such a way that those interactions are, the source of much significance, the source of much meaning. As I said a couple of minutes ago, it's the poet's job to take what's essentially unordered, what's a chaotic mess, and to add meaning to it, to give form to it, right? So think in your head about how this is different from a scientific worldview, right? Which tries to explain by dividing things up, by drawing boundaries. A lot of philosophy does that as well, right? Art, not so much. Art's agenda, if you will, is different. It's still, to a certain extent, situated towards this goal or telos, right? Telos, Greek word, it just means end or aim of explanation, but it's a different sort of explanation. It's not factual, it's not empirical, right? It's this open-ended relative nature that enables two people to look at a painting or sculpture or dance or whatever and disagree about the meaning of it. Okay, so with that, let's just make a couple of final comparisons to the Innisfree poem. I don't want to go on too long here, and I'm sure you guys heard my wife dealing with a crying baby, so I need to wrap this up. But note the lack of sentimentality in this poem compared to Innisfree. We talked about how after Nietzsche, Yeats wanted to take out some of that overly emotional focus in his work. You can see it here. It doesn't mean that there's no emotional nature to it. In fact, as I've said, it's a very melancholic poem. There's a lot here emotionally. But in terms of explicit emotional commentary, you don't really have a ton of that. There's really mostly description. And it's in the description that we're able interpretively to withdraw or derive the emotional claim that's being made, but it's not written there on the page itself, okay? You have maybe a couple small little examples like "My heart is sore," which is simple, right? It's concise. He doesn't go on and on about it. It's really quite different from the focus on sentiment and emotion that we have in Innisfree. We also have the poet's subjectivity. So a focus in Innisfree is the I, right? The self, the subject. And it's still the object of reflection here in this poem, but it's not carried out in the same way. In Innisfree, you have this pronounced longing for peace, for simple living with nature, where peace really does not come into the swans at cool at all. Simple living with nature we do see in the image of the first stanza, but as I said a few moments ago, we really pivot away from that movement and go somewhere else in this poem, and that's kind of the point, right? It would be a misreading of this poem to focus only on that first stanza and this image of nature and stillness, right? There's really much more richness and complexity to it than that. So here we have a speaker who is in his autumn years compared to the youthful vivaciousness of Innisfree. Because the poet is in his autumn years, you do have a little bit of melancholy. You've got a pensive sort of feel to it. But as Gates points out, I saw this on the Yale Modernism Lab website, you want to pay attention to the response to the melancholy. So again, it would be a misreading to look at this poem and dwell only on the melancholy, to say that that's, the real significance of this is this reflection on this particular emotion, this melancholy disposition. What's more important is what you do with the melancholy. And this was really the main, crown to my interpretation, which was it's looking at your life in a different way and participating in or grasping in eternal truth and beauty with this model that's found in nature, right? In the way in which these certain animals are dealing with one another, right? That's, I hate to use the word lesson or moral, but that's kind of the point here, right? That we can take this and implement it and appropriate it and use it to improve or refine our own lives. One other thing to talk about in distinction to Innisfree, you can hear the difference in the language. When you read this and then you go back and you look at Innisfree, you can really see how Innisfree comes off as overly formal compared to this. This has a very simple sort of approach to language that is just completely different from what you find in Innisfree. This poem, some of the short lines are almost reminiscent of someone like Hemingway, right? Just the simple, matter-of-fact, almost journalistic expression that isn't saturated with overly formal language, isn't saturated with formal structure, isn't saturated with sentimentality. So another quote from Tobin: Yeats is searching for a more permanent type of beauty in a world that's constantly changing, where nothing lasts. Look at the final stanza that juxtaposes timelessness on the one hand and the world of change on the other. So, what is this poem more than anything else about? It's about self-transcendence. It's about overcoming your own mortality, your own finite nature, your temporal nature. It's about surpassing all of that and elevating yourself to the plane of eternal beauty. As Gates puts it, by creating this textual image of his experience and the dialogue he establishes with the reader, he has, in language itself, found the eternal. And this is exactly what I was talking about when I said this thing's, 100 years old at this point, and we're still able to read it, we're still able to feel it, and perhaps most importantly, we're still able to make certain changes to our own lives based on this powerful effect that art has on us. Okay, so a couple of sources, and when I put this on YouTube, I'm going to have a couple of links for you, really focused mostly on how Innisfree is referred to in pop culture. I've got a couple of songs. One's Cranberries and one is Fleet Foxes. Cranberries, everybody knows Fleet Foxes, indie band. And then I've got also a site that gives you proposed sheet music for Innisfree. And it is not the only attempt at that. There are a lot of different attempts to put music to the verse that Yeats has composed. Make sure you fill out the lecture response. I hope you have a great day.